Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the just announced Sigma 35mm F1.4. This is DG, meaning it's full frame. It is DN, meaning it's designed specifically for mirrorless, and it is from their Art series. Now, it's hard to believe at this stage that just a few years ago, Sigma had 0 lenses for Sony FE or full frame E-mount. And they were a little bit late, maybe coming to the party on that, but certainly they have come full force. But I think in some ways, their initial kind of effort to get lenses on the platform, rather than using the Sigma MC11 mount converter adapter, they decided to repurpose about 9 of their existing lenses and to create FE versions of them, basically with the adapter built into the mount. And there was a extra spacer that was there to account for the different flange, different distance when the optical path is moved forward, as it is in mirrorless lenses, relative to not having that mirror in place, space for the mirror to come down. And so, that's where the mirrorless comes from. So as a byproduct of that, they ended up with a 35mm f1.4 art lens as a part of that. But it was the original 35mm f1.4 art that goes back now 7 or 8 years ago that actually was the very first of the art series and the beginning of their kind of new global vision at that point. So the byproduct of that, why I say it's unfortunate in the present, is that those lenses were basically at best a stopgap to try to get some lenses out there to be sold on what was becoming an increasingly popular platform. But what it does now is it's going to create a little bit of market confusion in that we have a brand new lens, which by the way is a superior lens in basically every metric to that original lens. But it is the exact same focal length, it's the exact same designation, and the only difference is the DN in there to let you know that it was designed for mirrorless specifically. And so I do want to make it very clear at the onset of this review, this is a brand new lens. It is not the same as that previous lens, and this is one that, like the 85mm f1.4 DN, is specifically designed for mirrorless. I'm reviewing it on a Sony FE or full frame E mount. There's also a Leica L mount version available. But this is a brand new lens that is purposely designed from the ground up for mirrorless, and it shows. Now this is actually the third DN 35mm lens that Sigma has already designed at this point. The first of those was the massive and massively expensive 35mm f1.2 DN Art Series lens. They followed that up at the end of 2020 with the 35mm f2 DN lens from the I series, a much more compact lens. And in my text review, I kind of described this lens as probably being what we call the Goldilocks lens, from the classic tale that one was too hot, one was too cold, but one was just right. I think for many photographers, this will be the just right lens, in that while they would maybe like the performance of the 35mm f1.2, they don't want to pay the higher price or deal with the much larger bulk of that lens, over 1,000 grams relative to this lens's, under 700 grams. At the same time, they also don't want to pay the massive price, $1,699 US versus $899 US. And then for others, they don't want to go as small a maximum aperture as f2, so they want what they would consider the pro-grade performance of an f1.4 lens. And so this lens is really going to fill that niche very, very nicely. And as we're going to see, its performance makes it a truly exceptional lens. I first want to thank our sponsors of today's episode, which is Phantom Wallet, which have been great partners to this channel and helping to bring you content for the last year and a half or so. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from the bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display,
and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code Dustin15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
Now today we're doing the definitive review, meaning that we're going to take a deeper dive into the various aspects of performance of this particular lens. And so if you want a quicker overview type review, check out the standard review instead. We're going to start by taking a look a little bit closer at the build and the design. As always with these Sigma Art Series lenses, it comes with a nice pouch. It comes with a nicely designed lens hood. You're getting a lot for your money, but most importantly, you're getting some great design elements in the lens itself. Let's take a closer look. One of the things that Sigma emphasizes in the design of the new 35mm F1.4 DN is that there is a wider variety of materials that are used in construction to give us a nice lightweight and yet pro-grade build. This, like many other recent Sigma lenses, is a very feature-rich lens. It has all of the same things as the GM lens does, the focus hold button, AF/MF switch, and then a variety of different controls when it comes to the aperture, which allows you to either have a clicked aperture with 1/3 stop detents, or you can click a switch to declick it and then have a smooth aperture racking through without any kind of detents, where you can just smoothly go back and forth. And it also has a unique Sigma feature, which is a aperture lock, which allows you to lock into either the automatic or the manual space. And so if you don't want to mess with an aperture ring, just lock it in the A mode and you'll never have to worry about it. If you like using the manual aperture ring, you can lock it into that so you don't inadvertently slip into the automatic mode. But the nice thing is here is you have a variety of options when it comes to that. It also has a thorough weather sealing that starts with a gasket at the lens mount. It has a flooring-like coating on the front to repel fingerprints and oils. It also has internal seals at the various switches and rings. It does come with a nice lens hood, and like most Sigma lens hoods, there's a variety of materials on there. There's internal ribs. There's also a locking mechanism to make sure that you don't inadvertently bump it out of position. Inside we have a total of 11 rounded aperture blades that give us a nice circular shape as the lens is stopped down. We can also see here that the manual focus ring is nice and wide, it's ribbed, it also has nice damping and feel to it, and a good performance overall. The lens itself is 75.5 millimeters in diameter, 111.5 millimeters in length, and it weighs in at 640 grams or 22.6 ounces. There's a 67 millimeter front filter thread. Overall, we have a nicely built lens here that feels professional grade. So in many ways, this is a familiar looking lens, but I feel like Sigma has done a great job of evolving their lenses to meet modern expectations, you know, with more weather sealing, with more of the Sony features that help this lens to be truly competitive with G Master lenses in terms of the feature set. But so now you have a lens that has a great mix of different materials to keep the weight moderate, but you can tell that the build quality is high. It feels like a pro grade lens. It handles great. And so nothing but good really to report on that front. Let's take a look at the autofocus performance as well, because there is more good things to be found in that metric. Let's jump in and let's take a look. Now Sigma has equipped this particular lens with a stepping motor, which doesn't necessarily tell all the story. In this case, we have very fast, very quiet, very accurate autofocus. That's not always the case with STM necessarily. But I think maybe the genius in the design here is that Sigma has really designed this lens to where there is a minimal amount of effort required to move the single element that is involved in focus. That is a mid-focus element, as you can see from this diagram. And the byproduct of that is that the focus motor doesn't have to push a whole group of elements, but rather just that one single, and as you can see, not overly large element. The byproduct of this is that there is just incredible speed as a part of focus, to where going from a close subject to a distant subject is basically instantaneous. There is no sound that I have ever heard at any point in focus. In fact, if we take a look at our focus pulls test here, we can see that there is no sound and no drama involved in focus. So that's pretty close to flawless, and you can also see as a part of the focus pools, which you could almost want to maybe detune those a bit if you were you know, doing actual video work, because they're so snappy. But it goes to show just how fast the focusing element and the focus motor achieves that focus. Beyond that, I saw very good reliability even at f1.4 when tracking my face approaching the camera. And as you can see in this sequence, and it stayed on me as I kind of looked away and did some various things like that. I'm actually filming on it for this section at the moment, and so you can see how it tracks my eyes for just kind of a static setting like this. But overall, I saw really great autofocus. And so that included perfect tracking of the eye when it came to doing some portraits, and as you can see, everything is really well focused for that. I had good PET IAF focus, and as you can see from these shots, whether it was either looking at the camera or looking to the side, I had just perfect focus there and incredibly sharp results, as you can see. And so autofocus really has been, you know, pretty much a delight, and beyond that, manual focus also works well with very good damping, even though it's focus emulation, focus by wire, so very good focus feel, really, and it also seems to operate in a linear fashion, and so it's going to give you the ability to have some repeatable results. And so overall, focus is a highlight of this lens. I would not hesitate to use it for any kind of professional application, be it shooting weddings, shooting portraits, because it's just delivering reliable results, and also with enough speed that you could also use this if you were involved in reportage or some other setting where you needed just a little bit more focus speed for shooting at a 35mm focal length. And so I've been nothing but satisfied with the autofocus performance on this lens and all the situations I've put it in, with people, with animals, just out general purpose shooting. It's really just done a great job. And even when I threw an ND 1000, that's a 10-stop ND filter on there, it autofocus just, you know, instantaneously, which of course has a lot to do with the camera body, obviously, but it also has something to do with the performance of the lens itself. And the nice thing, of course, with f1.4 lenses is the aperture opens up nice and big, which means that in low light conditions, you can get more light to the sensor, which gives you often better sensitivity in low light situations. So lots of good stuff there. So how about the overall image quality? We're going to take a deep dive and look at the performance of this somewhat astoundingly sharp lens. Let's dive in, let's take a look. So first of all, let's take a look at our vignette and distortion here. As you can see, there is a mild amount of barrel distortion, nothing significant here, probably nothing that'll ever cause you a problem. Here's a manual correction with just a +3, and we can see that it's mostly linear, a little bit in the corners here we can see that there's a slightly non-linear aspect of the distortion, so that'll correct a little bit better once there's an actual profile and I'm not using a manual slider. When it comes to the actual vignette, you can see that the vignette is what I would call moderate. You can definitely see it fairly strongly into the corners, but it's only about 2 stops or slightly under that. I was able to correct with a +51 and then moving the midpoint slider all the way over to 0, and that allows you, as you can see, to get a nicely corrected result. Again, you're going to get corrections in camera for JPEGs and video, and you'll see, I'm sure, a profile for RAW showing up in your favorite piece of software shortly. Now, most chromatic aberrations are quite well controlled here, but as you can see in this shot, of Loki on his whiskers. This is f1.4, so first of all, you can get a foreshadowing of how sharp this lens is. But you can see in the whiskers here, you can see a little bit of purple fringing, reddish purple before the plane of focus, a little bit of green afterwards, but it's fairly non-destructive. As you can see, I don't think it's going to be a real-world problem for anyone. Lateral chromatic aberrations are basically non-existent. You can't see any fringing on either side of the black and white transition areas, and so don't worry about lateral CA being an issue at all. So this sets us up, obviously, to see a strong optical performance. This is the very first lens that I have done on the new Sony Alpha 1, and so we're now working on a 50 megapixel sensor here. So we can see even at 200% at 50 megapixels, that resolution in the center of the frame and contrast are fabulous. You can see the weave and the bill even from that distance. Lots of information, very, very sharp. If we look over here, you can see lots of detail in the Prime Minister's face, and down even into the extreme corner, we can see that resolution is good with only a little bit of fall off in the very, very extreme corner where there's a little bit of softening. Overall, however, this is an incredibly sharp performance at various aspects of the frame. Great detail, very, very well done. Even at f1.4, this lens is so sharp that some portrait photographers might find it a little bit too sharp, in that it's going to show all of the skin imperfections. Though my experience is that it's not difficult to tone down sharpness. It's easier to reduce sharpness than it is to add it artificially. In this f1.4 shot of Loki, you can see that the detail is just fantastic. You can also see, in contrast, I mean, just look around the eye. All the definition and delineation of all those fine hairs is really amazing. And of course, autofocus has nailed it here as well. Even landscapes at f1.4, you can see at a further distance, it's not just optimized for one focus distance, but resolution and contrast are fantastic here at f1.4. You know, depth of field doesn't allow you to necessarily hit every bit of the corner, but you can see all the way out to the edge here on the fence just how detailed, just contrast everywhere is excellent. Even on these bright transition areas, you're not seeing any fringing that is marring the contrast of the image. So the lens is so sharp wide open that you might question whether or not there's any more left in the tank. The reality is that we see a bit more resolution. We can also see a bit of a moire pattern starting to develop just because resolution is just so high, and so a little bit of false color there, but you can see contrast is better still. If we move to the mid frame, it is just, I mean, it's popping off the page now. Incredibly, incredibly sharp. And old Winston, you can see all the fine detail in the patterning of the bill, contrast in Parliament buildings there, looking fantastic. Down into the corner, we can see that we're starting to sharpen up there, even into the extreme corner, and at f2.8. We can see now that our resolution has gotten intense even into, and contrast right into the very corner of the frame. Maybe even a hair more at f4, where now our just contrast and resolution is intense all across the frame. So at landscape apertures, we're just going to see an amazing amount of detail all across the frame with this lens. This would be a really incredible landscape lens if you're someone that values very intense resolution and contrast. We can see that, you know, it's great at f1.4, and it's a little bit better still at f5.6, though is, you know, obviously great to begin with, but contrast and detail just looks, you know, fantastic. And now, you know, depth of field is deeper here, and so you can just see all across the frame, everywhere you look, there's just great amounts of detail, and you know, all of the little fine delineation of textures is all just beautifully rendered here right out into the corners. One more landscape type image, you can see that everywhere you look here, it is just, there's just so much texture information. And so this is a lens that is easily going to handle the higher resolution Sony, you know, Sigma or Leica sensors that you might put it on. So our minimum focus distance of 30 centimeters or a foot gives us a right under 0.19 times magnification, which is useful, not as good as the new GM lens, however, which has, I believe, a 0.26 times magnification. Up close image quality is good, with a little bit of room for improvement of contrast, which we see an improvement if we stop it on down. That contrast becomes a little bit better at around f2 here. I found color from the lens to be quite nice and maybe ever so slightly on the cool side, but colors do seem to be quite accurate out of it, and so I think that you'll enjoy the look of images that come off of it. Now, when you have a lens this sharp and well corrected, the question becomes if that comes at the cost of the overall rendering and the bokeh quality. And so in this case, we can see, taking a look at the bokeh circles, that they're nice and clean, obviously no fringing on them, and no kind of onion quality inside. We also saw earlier on that the geometry really is quite good, and so here you can see that even towards the edge of the frame that the bokeh circles stay quite circular, so it does a good job on that metric as well. Now in terms of the quality of the blur, obviously with f1.4 lens, if you get close to the subject, you're able to pretty strongly defocus backgrounds. And so here there's ever so slightly a little bit of busyness there, but overall the effect is fairly creamy. In this shot, we've got foreground bokeh, which is nicely blurred. And then of course, if we look in towards the area of the subject here, it's very, very crisp. The background bokeh is also nice. Here again, we see a nice progressive fall off. And so I think the quality of the blur here is good. It's not incredibly creamy like some lenses that I've seen, but I think for being so high resolution and contrast, like you can see, it's holding up really well on the subject here, that the quality of the blur actually looks quite good. And in this, subject, which is a little bit challenging because of the bright, potential highlights on it, you can see it's rendered all of that fine detail, but also done a reasonably good job with the background in a fairly busy background. This image here is maybe one of my favorites in terms of the artistic quality of the blur. Obviously it's always going to depend on the background, how well things translate. But in this, I'm very impressed with what it's done with the foreground, which is incredibly crisp. But then the quality of the background also looks fairly good, fairly artful. One more in this vein, and so we've got a lock in the foreground, and again, great detail at f1.4, and then you can see the bokeh fall off, and I'll let you make your own judgments as to how you like the quality of that blur, since it is a subjective measure. Now the 35mm f1.4 DN is an unusually good lens, wide aperture lens at f1.4 for shooting the night sky. So this is a great additional application in that you can see as we pan out towards the extreme corners that stars stay very, very much like distinct points of light, and without growing any kind of wings. There's not a lot of fringing here on this, and so overall this is a really, really great result. We've got a asteroid that is shooting through the frame there. I'm actually quite impressed. Stopping down to f2, it helps in the sense of reducing vignette somewhat, which you could correct anyway, but because the instances of coma were already quite low, I don't see a radical difference here. And so this is a rare lens where I would say go ahead and shoot it at f1.4 and maximize that light gathering potential. Finally, you can see, as was my kind of observation in general, that it also is very good with flare resistance. The sun coming out from behind the cloud very intensely at this point, it's more so than what you can maybe see in this image. But this was the sum total of the ghosting artifacts that I could find. Very good, retention of contrast. And here you can start to see the sunburst effect from the 11-bladed aperture. And at this stage, it's rather than introducing more flare artifacts, I really don't see any new ones. There's, a tiny bit of a prismatic kind of patterning that comes off this, but not destructive in the least. And so overall, a really great performance. This is a very well-corrected lens, but I think still retains some character. And so as you can see, while I would say that the scale is tilted towards the sharpness and resolution performance of the spectrum, I mean, this is a very highly corrected lens, obviously. I don't think that we have totally lost all of the character and the bokeh quality of the lens. I don't think that it's utterly creamy like the Zeiss Milvus 35mm f1.4, maybe not even as much as the Canon 35mm f1.4 L Mark II. But at the same time, I think that the bokeh is pleasing from the lens. There's nothing that is wrong with it, and I think that images look very good from the lens itself. And so I think that Sigma has managed to nail a lens that is both technically strong but also is not entirely soulless at the same time. So kudos to them on that front. And so as I said at the beginning of the introduction, I think that for many photographers, while Sony's new 35mm f1.4 GM is obviously a fantastic lens, this is a lens that comes in at a full $500 US cheaper. And so for many photographers, that can be all the difference in the world as to whether or not they can afford to buy a 35mm prime or not. And in this case, the difference in price, say relative to the Sony 35mm f1.8, is under $200. And so I think for many photographers, the blend of price, performance, size is going to be the Goldilocks option. And I think for many photographers, this is going to be a very welcome addition to the Sony FE lineup. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also to an image gallery. Check out the photos that I've taken to give you a sense of performance there. There's also linkage there if you would like to purchase some of my merchandise or to follow me on social media, to become a patron. Sign up for my newsletter that comes out every Thursday. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.